Good morning, Borodar, and welcome, Croiser, to our webinar on shared lives and mental health crisis, which we hope will be informative, engaging and inspiring. We have lots of speakers to give you multiple perspectives on the work, and there will be a chance to ask questions at the end. So please use the chat function or the Q&A function. You'll see those buttons at the bottom of your screen to post your questions, and we'll pick those up at the end. My name is Benna. I'm Joint Head of Psychology, Counselling and Arts Therapies for an Iron Bevan University Health Board, and I'll be chairing and presenting this morning. So I'm now going to chair myself into my presentation. So I'm going to be talking to you about the development and implementation of the Shared Lives for Mental Health project. And really, this echoes, I think, lots of what Alex has been talking about. So essentially, I'm going to talk to you about is the ideas, the beginning of these ideas, so how we got there, to explain some of the key elements of the service and share our outcomes. So we have some data, but we also have lots of experiences of the project. So this is the guidance. So you can find it on the World Health Organization website, and it features 28 projects from around the world that are taking a recovery rights, person-centered approach within community mental health services. We are really honoured to be in it. There are another 2 services from the UK that are in there, but from the initial call out, we made it into the final cut. So we're delighted to have the kind of opportunity to share and disseminate what we think is a fantastic project, both in terms of the mental health crisis work, but also the wider Shared Lives service. So for us, where we started with this was thinking about our crisis services and a sense that they weren't working as well as they should for everybody. Actually, lots of people were telling us that things were not fitting together well. They were not well coordinated. They were not responsive. They were not. They didn't feel as if they were offering the kind of. There was lots of room for improvement, should we say? So I guess we wanted to start with the question of what matters to people when they're experiencing a crisis in their mental health. And if that conversation led on to some service redesign, we wanted that to be as broad as it could be. So Alex talked about a whole system approach. So we called it our whole person, whole system transformation process. How can we make sure that service users and carers alongside all our stakeholders are involved in shaping our services? So in order to begin this process, we set up an action learning set. It was quite a big commitment of time. So it was 6 days over 6 months to develop a new service model together. And we had all of these people involved. The International Mental Health Collaborating Network co-facilitated that alongside us in an Iron Bevan University Health Board. And as part of it, so we had lots of conversations. There were lots of really useful output, some of which I'm going to share with you in a moment. But we also had a look at some other services, visited some other services. So the services in Trieste, which were also featured in the World Health Organization guidance, and also the host families service in Hertfordshire, which was very helpful to us in influencing this particular project. So one of the questions we asked, so we took this big group of people that were working with us and we said, what's important to you when you're distressed and going through a difficult time? So if you look at those words that have come out more strongly, that more people said, what's really striking about that is the humanity, isn't it? It's that sense that these are relational needs that people have when they're in crisis. So I guess the question for us when we think about how do we create services that have relationships at the heart of them, that face-to-face, listen to, supportive experience, what services are going to best meet those kind of needs, and are we doing it as well as we can at the moment? So this was one of the models that came out of that work. So some of the services that you'll see in this model, we already had in place. So our crisis and treatment and liaison team, our inpatient provision, but we also wanted to put in place, been developed in the last couple of years or about to come online. Very excitingly, we're about to open our first support house in the next month or so. So really looking forward to that. So shared lives, you can see down at the bottom there, is one element of this whole person, whole system crisis transformation. And that model sits in the middle. So you can see it there in the green circle of what we hope are recovery-oriented services, preventing crises and resilient communities. The overall hopes are to develop services that are more recovery-oriented and rights-based, more truly community-based. And I think Alex talked about this also, this sense of, we have lots of services actually that we've located in the community, in clinics and various places, but actually really using the assets and the connections and the networks that sit within communities, really developing that alongside people, and more co-produced and person-centered, and that place the service user at the heart of our provision. So these are all, I've put more at the beginning of each of those bullet points because it feels as if we've come a long way in services. So it wasn't that we weren't doing any of these things before. There were lots of examples of fantastic practice, but we want to get better at it. And that will be an ongoing journey. It's something we're constantly working to get better at. So this is Shared Lives in Gwent. So what is it? You can see two of our carers, Jane and Martin, there in front of their home. So it offers a recovery-orientated supportive home environment to an acutely unwell service user as an alternative to inpatient admission or as an early discharge. But essentially it's an alternative to hospital. How's it different? So Alex has talked broadly about the main Shared Lives scheme, and there's some really key differences. So funded, lots of the values are absolutely the same, but I just want you to be clear about the differences. So it's funded by health, as I mentioned earlier, through Welsh Government mental health transformation monies, and we have recurrent funding for that, which is fantastic. So funded by health, we have a specialist coordinating team for the work, which is also funded by health, and Emma, who's the who coordinates that team, you're going to hear from in a moment. It's supported by our crisis teams. So crucially, our crisis teams are incredibly active in the support of people when they're acutely unwell, when they're in shared lives, and that joint working is absolutely critical. And the involvement for this project is shorter. So in fact, the stays that people have are generally on average 14 nights, which is roughly equivalent to our average inpatient stay, which is 12 nights. There is an option for longer term, so some people go on to have longer term contact, but actually that's a minority. So this really is an intervention which we're gearing up to be short term. And I think what's interesting as we go on to talk about the impact of it is, even without all of the kind of extra ongoing contact over years that Alex has talked about, that shared lives, the wider scheme, does so beautifully, just the experience of being with carers for that short period of time and cared for in a different way seems to be really important for people. So far, since our launch in 2019, we've had 73 people who've experienced a shared lives arrangement when they've been in crisis. And in terms of their experience of it, we have something called the Patient Experience Questionnaire that we use, which has a 0 to 10 rating scale, with 10 being excellent. So the average score at 9.19 is really high. So people are rating it as an incredibly positive experience. We have quite a bit of data. So we used a measure called the Recovery Quality of Life Scale. That's looking at scores as people enter a shared lives arrangement, and then their scores when they finish. And you can see from that diagram that the scores increase really significantly. And when you put that through a statistical significance test, p less than 0.001 is a really high level of significance. So it's a reliable and clinically significant difference. We wanted to make sure that this wasn't just a feature of people's recovery journeys. So we were able to compare with a group of matched controls prior to implementing shared lives. So we took a group of people that would have been, we would enable to access the scheme prior to setting up. And you can see there that people do improve on their equal scores whilst they're on an inpatient ward, but the difference is markedly more significant on in a shared lives arrangement. We also looked at the impact on admissions. So a number of people who use our services might have repeated crises. So admissions pre and post a shared life stay. So 90% of the people going into the scheme show a reduction in their admission rate. And you can see here, so this is a slightly complicated chart. So it's looking essentially at people who've used it over the last year. And it's comparing their period after, so if they went into a shared lives arrangement 10 to 12 months ago, it's comparing it with the 10 to 12 month period before that. So you can see that on the right hand side, and then similarly 7 to 9 months, 4 to 6 months, and 0 to 3 months. So each person is functioning as their own control, and you can see there's a really dramatic difference in what's happening with admissions. There's also something really interesting, I think, about Onward Referrals. So this is people's use of the mental health services pre and post a shared lives arrangement. So these will be things like referrals to a psychiatrist, a psychologist, an occupational therapist. So it's use of services, and you can see that there are marked reductions for people after they've used a shared lives arrangement. And we might have some hypotheses. I guess we could all think about why that might be, but that might be about improved networks, about improved recovery rates. All of these things feel as if they connect up. And it's worth thinking in this context in relation to both admissions and onward referrals about the cost avoidance that this is generating for us in health. And that's a really big part of why we're funding this. You know, we want better outcomes for people, but we know that that will pay back over time. So yeah. So what's much more powerful, I think, is what people say, and you'll be able to hear from Nikita and Mags very soon in terms of their experience of this. But these are lots of the quotes that we've collected over the time that we've been running the project. So these 3 quotes relate primarily to what we would call activities of daily living. So a sense that, so this gentleman at the top was in a shared lives arrangement and learned to cook while he was there. So that wasn't the result of a kind of occupational therapy intervention. That was just being in a normal family home and having the opportunity to learn to cook, and the impact that that had for him on going home and feeling like a proper dad. This sense, I think, in the orange quote is really interesting about some of the stuff that gets risk assessed off inpatient wards. So that notion, and Nikita will talk about this later in the video, the notion of kind of cutlery drawers with knives in them. The quote in the pink here talks about ironing. You know, these are not things that you have ready access to on an inpatient ward. And the risk, I guess, that the absence of those things is in some way potentially dehumanizing. So that sense for this person that being around all of those kind of normal things felt that they were being treated like a human being. The woman who did the ironing, that was our very first person who entered an arrangement, and it was huge for her. It was absolutely huge. It was a really big part of being able to recover, was having access to ironing and how that made her feel. This next handful of quotes, so there's something about the peace and quiet. I think a lot of us, when we think about going through hard times, talk about peace and quiet and how important that feels. That notion of sanctuary is often very a peaceful notion, isn't it? And I am aware that it's really hard on inpatient units to kind of create that sort of peace. So lots of people talk to us about how valuable it was having a quiet space and the calmness that comes with that. This quote on the left was from a husband of somebody who entered our shared life scheme. So talking about how powerful he'd originally thought that shared lives wouldn't be enough. There's a lot of anxiety around, you know, when people are acutely unwell, there's a lot of fear, a lot of concern about risks to the person. So he was concerned that shared lives wouldn't be enough. And what he says is, by the end of the 3 weeks, my wife actually came out for a meal with me and our son for his birthday, which is something she wouldn't have done in public before this stay. I think it worked because it gave my wife a chance to see how another ordinary family operated, and some of the pressures she was feeling are perfectly normal and understandable. So you have a sense there of the kind of normalizing, validating impact of living with another family. So this is a bit, these two quotes both relate to the kind of relational power of this setting for people. So a sense of kind of having somebody there to talk to. As nice as some of the ward staff are, they just don't have the time to talk to me and listen like the carer did. That's all I really needed, time and reassurance, which echoes, I think, a bit that early slide that I showed you with a kind of what do people need. And finally, that sense of community reintegration. So being able to go back and visit your house on a regular basis, building up your confidence to be back in a sense of normality. There's less of a kind of massive difference between the ward environment and coming back home because you are in somebody's home. So in conclusion to our quotes, this sense of the experience being life-changing. So remember, we're talking about a stay that was on average 14 days. It has been life-changing for me. And if this had been around years ago, perhaps I wouldn't have kept coming back onto the ward every few months. Thank you for helping me feel like me again. So I think those are really eloquent testimonies really to the power of this work. So if we're inspiring you, and you'll hear more from Emma about exactly how this works soon, but here are some things that you might want to be thinking about. So it's critical to engage your crisis teams and medical colleagues. Shared lives can't do this particular work on its own. And as Alex says, that whole system approach is really important, but having your kind of health colleagues on board is critical, and building relationships between them. So this has worked because of the relationships that have been developed, where the people within the partnership have high levels of trust of each other. Supporting a culture of positive risk-taking and psychological safety, that's particularly important for us in health. Remembering that our inpatient environments are not risk-free. So we're not comparing environments that are entirely risk-free with an environment where stuff can happen. Things happen on our inpatient wards, so it's important to hold that in mind when you're having these conversations, when people are feeling concerned about it. And promoting the World Health Organization guidance. I'm hoping there'll be other opportunities in the future to share more of the amazing best practice examples that are in there. But as a culture changing document, it feels really powerful. So I hope those are some kind of ideas and pointers, and please feel free to ask us more questions at the end. So these are our contact details, and we'll have these available on the website for future use. So don't worry if you don't catch them now.